I never expected my own mother to humiliate me on the happiest day of my life. But as she laughed at my engagement ring in front of everyone, I knew it was time. I knew it was time. Time to expose the pathetic lie she'd worn for 20 years. To understand how we reached that catastrophic moment at the dinner table, you gotta understand the woman my mother is. Her name is Eleanor. And for as long as I've been alive, her entire existence has been a meticulously curated performance. My mother doesn't live in the present moment. She lives entirely in the perceived gaze of other people. Everything she does, buys, and says is calculated. It's all designed to project this image of effortless wealth and absolute superiority. Growing up, our house was basically a museum of things we couldn't actually afford. It was all paid for by credit cards that my dad quietly panicked over late at night. I didn't even understand why I wasn't allowed to play in our own living room. I just knew I had to wear these stiff, itchy dresses to simple family barbecues. My mother's love always felt conditional, tied directly to how well I accessorized her life. If I looked like a miniature aristocrat, she beamed with pride. But if I came home with dirt on my knees, her face would tighten into this icy disappointment. She genuinely believed that the price tag on your clothing was the exact measure of your human worth. The absolute crown jewel of my mother's carefully constructed illusion was a piece of jewelry she called the Veronique Emerald. It was this massive, brilliant green stone surrounded by a halo of what she claimed were flawless diamonds. So, according to family lore, my dad bought it for her at a private estate auction in Paris. She claimed it was a genuine 1920s vintage piece. She wore it to weddings, galas, and every major family holiday. That necklace was her armor. Whenever she felt slighted, she'd make sure everyone saw it. Especially if her older sister, my Aunt Beatrice, was getting too much attention. Beatrice had actually married into real, generational wealth, so my mother's hand would flutter up to her collarbone, just to rest lightly on that emerald. It was her way of silently reminding everyone that she was someone of immense importance. I grew up revering that necklace, mostly because I was taught to. It was supposed to be our family legacy, a real symbol of my parents' glamorous past. But then my dad passed away, leaving behind a mountain of hidden debt. His life insurance barely even covered the mortgage. My mother's response to our sudden financial freefall was to just double down on the illusion. She ruthlessly cut corners on everything from groceries to my college tuition. She made sure to keep her country club membership, and she kept right on flaunting that emerald like nothing had changed. As for me, I took a totally different path. I was just exhausted by a lifetime of pretending to be something I wasn't. I really sought out authenticity. I craved things that were real, grounded, and honest, far away from that suffocating museum of a house. I went to a state school and worked my way through an art history degree. Eventually, I found my true calling as an estate liquidator and antique appraiser. My job is literally to look beneath the surface of beautiful old things. I separate the genuine artifacts from the clever replicas. I spend my days with a jeweler's loupe pressed to my eye, studying hallmarks and metal purities. I look for those subtle, telltale signs of real human craftsmanship. It's quiet, meticulous work, and I absolutely love it. It's the exact opposite of the flashy, empty world my mother built. Naturally, my mother hated my career. She thought it was terribly blue-collar to rummage through the belongings of dead people, as she so elegantly put it. She'd introduce me to her friends by saying I was in fine art curation. She completely erased the reality of my dusty, fascinating days. But I had long ago stopped trying to change her. I built a peaceful, independent life for myself. I surrounded myself with people who valued me for who I was, not what I wore. And the most important of those people was Julian. Julian was everything my mother despised. Which is to say, he was genuine, unpretentious, and completely unimpressed by artificial status. He was a high school science teacher. He spent his weekends hiking and volunteering at a local community garden. He drove a 10-year-old car and wore flannel shirts that had definitely seen better days. But he had the kindest, most observant eyes I'd ever encountered. When I was with Julian, I didn't have to perform. I could just breathe. I loved him with a fierce, protective certainty. I knew very early on that he was the man I was going to marry. We were completely on the same page about our values. That became really obvious when we started talking about getting engaged. When Julian and I started talking about getting engaged, we were totally on the same page. I didn't want some massive, flawless diamond that cost as much as a house down payment. Just the thought of wearing something that expensive made me anxious. It just felt completely against everything we valued. Instead of hitting up those luxury stores, we spent months hunting for something that actually meant something. We finally found this amazing independent artisan who specialized in ethical, nature-inspired jewelry. We wanted a ring that told a story, Not just something that showed off a price tag. Julian worked with her to design this beautiful, delicate ring. It had this modest Montana sapphire right in the center. And it was flanked by 2 tiny reclaimed diamonds that actually belonged to his late grandmother. The band was cast to look exactly like intertwined twigs. It was earthy, unique, and just incredibly personal. To me, it was the most breathtaking piece of jewelry in the entire world. It represented everything we were building together. No pretense, just pure, honest craftsmanship. The night Julian proposed, it was just the 2 of us out on the porch of this mountain cabin. There was no photographer hiding in the bushes. No grand, orchestrated spectacle meant for social media. It was quiet, tearful, and, honestly, perfect. When he slid that delicate sapphire onto my finger, it felt like a promise of a lifetime of peace. I looked down at my hand with tears in my eyes. I just knew I had found my true home. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered joy. But, of course, the peace couldn't last. We had to tell my mother. The reality of her expectations just loomed over us like a dark cloud. I knew it was going to threaten our little bubble of happiness. We drove to her house the following Sunday to share the news. I had totally braced myself for her reaction, knowing how obsessed she is with carat sizes and brand names. But a small, naive part of me hoped she'd just be happy for me. Just this once, she could set her vanity aside. We sat down in her impeccably decorated living room. Julian was just beaming with pride when he told her the news. My mother sat across from us, perfectly put together as always. The air in the room instantly felt suffocating. Her eyes instantly darted to my left hand. She didn't look at my face, and she definitely didn't look at Julian. She looked straight at the ring. I watched her expression shift from polite anticipation to this cold, flat calculation. She leaned forward, squinting like she couldn't quite see it. She leaned back, dripping with this fake sweetness. "Oh," she said, "how quaint." My heart just completely sank into my stomach. I tried to fill that awful silence. I started babbling nervously about how Julian designed it himself. I told her the sapphire was from Montana and the side stones were his grandmother's. I was practically begging her to see the sentimental value instead of a price tag. She just gave me this tight, patronizing smile. She called it a very sweet little promise ring. Then she actually said she was sure Julian would upgrade it to a proper diamond once his career was established. Julian's hand tightened around mine. He's a deeply patient guy, but I could feel that insult land. He didn't lose his temper, though. He just politely told her it wasn't a promise ring and that we were both thrilled with it. She didn't even argue. She just let out this soft, pitying sigh and patted my knee. Then she completely changed the subject to her upcoming country club luncheon. It was like our engagement was just too trivial to talk about. I really should have just let it go right then. I should have accepted she was never going to be the mom I needed. But over the next few weeks, things escalated. It went from passive-aggressive little comments to active sabotage. She started calling me constantly while I was working. Oh my God, my phone was just blowing up with links to these massive, flashy diamond rings. She was relentless. She thought she could just wear me down until I gave in. Then she actually suggested my Aunt Beatrice could help finance a quote-unquote real ring. She said she didn't want me to be embarrassed in front of the family. I finally snapped and told her to stop. I loved my ring, and I wasn't changing it. When she realized she couldn't manipulate me, she took a totally different route. I didn't even find out about it until days later. She secretly reached out to Julian. She invited him to coffee while I was busy at work. She sat him down and gave him this lecture about how a man's worth is judged by how he provides. She looked him right in the eye and said my ring was an embarrassment to the family. She even offered him a loan to buy a 2-carat diamond. When Julian told me about that coffee date, he wasn't even mad. He just felt sad for me. He saw right through her insecurity. But I wasn't sad. I was feeling this cold, white-hot fury that I'd never really felt before. She was actively trying to poison the purest, happiest thing in my life, just to protect her imaginary social standing. The real breaking point hit a few days later. She announced she was hosting this big engagement dinner for us. She framed it as a generous gift, but I knew exactly what it was. It was a stage. A chance for her to play the grand matriarch and control the whole narrative. I tried to say no, but she immediately weaponized the guilt trips. She started crying about being a lonely widow just trying to celebrate her only child. It was exhausting. Exhausted and foolishly hoping to just keep the peace, Julian and I finally caved and agreed to go. 2 days before the dinner, I went over to my mom's house. I was supposed to help her sort out some floral arrangements for the party. I just wanted to get in and get out. She was upstairs taking a bath, so I was left completely alone in her bedroom. I was digging around in her walk-in closet looking for a specific vase. The house was dead quiet, and as I was reaching up to a top shelf, something caught my eye. Sitting right on top of her vanity was her heavy velvet jewelry box, wide open. And resting right there on the velvet was the Veronique Emerald. I just stopped and stared at it. I'd seen that necklace 1,000 times from across a room, but I'd never actually been allowed near it. She always claimed the oils from my skin would dull the stones. But standing there all alone, the professional appraiser in me just took over. I don't even know what compelled me to do it. I slowly walked over to the vanity. I reached out and picked it up from the velvet. The very first thing I noticed was the weight. Or honestly, the total lack of it. A collar made of solid platinum and massive stones should have a really significant, satisfying heft to it. Platinum is one of the densest, heaviest precious metals in the world.
but the necklace in my hand felt surprisingly light.
It felt exactly like cheap cast brass. Frowning, I carried the piece over to the window to get a better look in the natural light. As I turned it over, the temperature of the metal struck me. Real precious metals and genuine gemstones are excellent thermal conductors. They feel distinctly cold to the touch when you first pick them up. But this piece? It felt room temperature. It felt warm. My heart started beating a little faster. It just hit me like this strange, chaotic mix of disbelief and professional curiosity just washed over me. Out of habit, I always carried a small 10-power jeweler's loop in my purse.
I walked out to the hallway, grabbed my bag, and pulled out the loop.
Then I walked right back to the window. I pressed the small lens to my eye and brought the necklace up to the light. The moment the metal came into focus under the magnification, the whole illusion shattered. The grand, imposing Veronique Emerald fell into a million pathetic pieces. It wasn't just a fake. It was a remarkably cheap fake. I started by examining the hallmarks on the clasp. These were the stamps that supposedly proved its 1920s French origin. But under the loop, I could clearly see the truth. The stamps hadn't been struck into the metal with a steel punch. They had been cast directly into the mold. That's a telltale sign of mass-produced replica jewelry. And right next to the supposed platinum mark was a tiny, almost microscopic stamp. It read CZ, cubic zirconia. I moved the loop down to the halo of diamonds. They weren't diamonds. They weren't even good cubic zirconia. Under magnification, I could see the soft, rounded facet edges. You only see that in molded glass or cheap crystal. Genuine diamonds have razor-sharp facet junctions. Some of these stones even had tiny air bubbles trapped inside them. That's an absolute impossibility for a diamond. But it's a very common flaw in poured glass. Then I looked at the center stone, the legendary Priceless Emerald. I almost laughed out loud. The stone was held in place by thick, clumsy prongs. They lacked any of the delicate refinement of high-end jewelry. But the real smoking gun was the back of the setting. Authentic, high-quality emeralds are set with an open back. It allows light to pass through the stone and show off its natural color. But the back of this setting was completely enclosed by metal. When I looked closely at the edges where the stone met the metal, I saw it. Foil. It was a foil-backed piece of green glass. To make matters worse, I could actually see the dried, yellowed residue of epoxy glue. I just stood there in her bedroom, staring at this piece of literal garbage in my hands. The necklace she used to make everyone else feel small probably cost less than $100 at a costume shop. My dad never bought this at some private auction in Paris. She had spent 20 years lying to our family, lying to her friends, and lying to me. And she had the absolute nerve to call Julian's heartfelt, custom-made ring a cheap embarrassment. I carefully placed the necklace back in the box, exactly the way I found it. I didn't say a single word when my mother finally came downstairs. I just walked into the living room and helped her sort out the flowers for the dinner. She had no idea that I knew. I stood right next to her, handing her stems of lilies while she complained about the florist. For the first time in my life, I saw right through her entire performance. I just kissed her on the cheek and left. I didn't tell Julian what I found right away. I really needed time to process the sheer magnitude of the hypocrisy. I spent the next 2 days just bouncing back and forth between pity and absolute rage. Part of me felt sad for a woman so empty she needed fake jewelry to feel important. But mostly, I was just furious. I thought about how she tried to manipulate Julian behind my back. By the time the engagement dinner rolled around, my sadness was completely gone. It was replaced by this cold, crystal clear resolve. I was officially done shrinking myself to protect her fragile, venomous ego. The private room she booked at the restaurant was dripping with absolute excess. Heavy velvet curtains, massive crystal chandeliers, and fine china everywhere. It was the perfect theatrical stage for her to play the grand matriarch. My mother was holding court right at the head of the table in a sleek black gown. And there, resting heavily on her collarbone, was the fake emerald. She looked so smug, just soaking up all the compliments from her friends. Aunt Beatrice was seated right near her, wearing a quiet, genuinely expensive string of real pearls. Beatrice always looked a little bored by my mother's theatrics. She was the only one in the room with actual generational wealth. Julian and I were seated near the middle of the table. True to form, my mother had arranged the seating so she was the focal point. Throughout the first 2 courses, she completely dominated the conversation. She bragged about her golf handicap and name-dropped people who barely knew her. Then she started in on Julian and me. It started subtly when a friend of hers asked Julian how the wedding planning was going. Julian smiled and said we were thinking of keeping it small. He mentioned maybe an outdoor ceremony in a botanical garden. My mother let out this loud, theatrical sigh and waved her wine glass. She told the whole table that an outdoor wedding is just a barbecue in a white dress. Then she sneered and said she supposed it matched the ring. The whole table went dead quiet. I saw several people awkwardly glance at my hand. I felt Julian stiffen right beside me. I quickly placed my hand over his under the table, just signaling him to wait. Aunt Beatrice actually frowned and spoke up. She asked what was wrong with the ring, saying she thought it was beautiful and very unique. It was the only lifeline anyone threw us. My mother just offered this condescending little laugh. She called it a sweet starter ring and said Julian is a teacher, bless his heart, so we have to be realistic about what he can provide. She actually said I was settling for less. She paused to take a sip of her wine, making sure she had everyone's full attention. Then she reached up and let her fingers rest right on that green glass at her throat. It was her ultimate power move. Her voice was just dripping with this fake maternal concern. She told the room that jewelry is an investment that tells the world who you are. She repeated that lie about my dad buying the emerald in Paris, saying a woman's jewelry should reflect her worth. She looked directly at me, and then she laughed. It wasn't a booming laugh, but this soft, dismissive, tinkling sound. It was a laugh that said, my life, my choices, and the man I loved were fundamentally pathetic. That was it. That was the exact moment the last string tying me to her toxic expectations snapped. I didn't yell, and I didn't cry. I just felt this incredible, eerie sense of calm wash over me as I picked up my water glass. I set my glass down. I didn't yell, and I didn't cry. I just looked right into her eyes. I told her I'd been thinking a lot about the Veronique Emerald lately, especially with all my appraisal work. Her smile slipped for just a second, but she recovered fast, stiffening up in her chair. She tried to brush it off, saying her necklace was leagues above anything I handled at my little estate sales. I didn't take the bait. I just told her it was certainly unique. I said I was actually so fascinated by it. I took the liberty of looking at it through my jeweler's loupe while she was upstairs. The color drained out of her face so fast, I thought she was going to pass out. Her hand just dropped right off the necklace and into her lap. The whole room went dead silent. Nobody even moved. Julian turned to look at me, totally confused about what was happening. But he didn't say a word. He just stayed perfectly still and let me take the floor. He knew I had this. My mom snapped at me, her voice all sharp and breathless. She told me I knew I was never supposed to touch her jewelry. She tried to tell everyone the piece was priceless. I kept my voice totally calm, almost like I was giving a lecture. I told her priceless wasn't exactly the word I'd use. Then I brought up the hallmarks on the clasp, asking if it was really a 1920s Van Cleef. She hissed yes, her eyes darting nervously over to Aunt Beatrice. She was totally trapped, but she doubled down on the lie about buying it at a private auction in Paris. I just nodded slowly. I explained that Van Cleef always hand-punched their hallmarks into solid platinum. But the marks on her clasp, they were cast right into the metal. A dead giveaway for a cheap fake. And then I dropped the real hammer. I told the whole table there was a tiny secondary stamp right next to the fake platinum mark. It said CZ, cubic zirconia. A collective gasp rippled through the older women at the table. My mother's mouth fell open, but no sound came out. She just sat there, looking like a fish gasping for air. I didn't break eye contact with her. I stood up slowly from my chair. I wanted her to feel the full weight of what was happening. I kept going, my voice steady and relentless. I told them the diamonds in the halo had molded facet junctions and trapped air bubbles. That meant they were just poured glass. But the most interesting part was the emerald itself. A genuine, high-quality emerald of that size would be set with an open back to let the light through. But her setting was completely enclosed. My mother whispered at me to stop right now. Her voice was trembling with this crazy mix of panic and rage. She told me I was embarrassing myself. I told her I really wasn't. I noticed the stone was backed with green foil to make it look shiny. It was held in place with cheap epoxy glue. I could actually see the dried yellow residue under the prongs. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then I told her, before she ever lectures my fiancé about real value, say she should take off the $60 piece of foil-backed glass she's been parading around for 20 years.
The silence that followed was deafening.
It was the kind of silence that literally rings in your ears. Nobody looked at my mother. They all just stared down at their plates, avoiding the woman who had just been completely destroyed. My Aunt Beatrice was the first to react. She didn't gasp or look shocked. Instead, a slow, knowing smirk spread across her face. She adjusted her genuine pearls and took a slow sip of wine. She always knew my mother was a fraud. My mother's face went from pale to a mottled, furious red. Her hands were shaking violently. She reached up and unclasped the necklace, practically tearing it from her throat. The illusion was dead, and she knew it. She didn't even try to defend it or make up another lie. She just shoved that piece of junk right into her purse with shaking hands. 20 years of pretending, all crumpled up at the bottom of a designer bag. I think she really wanted to call me a liar right then and there. You could see her brain scrambling for an excuse to save face. But then she looked around the room. Everyone knew the truth. The silence in that dining room was so heavy you could practically choke on it. Then she just bolted up from the table. Her chair scraped so loud against the hardwood it made people jump. She didn't say a single word to me. And she didn't even look at Julian. She just grabbed her expensive coat off the chair and practically ran for the door, completely defeated. We all just stood there and watched her leave the room without a fight. And then the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her. Just like that, the grand show was finally over. I stood there for a second, just letting my racing heart slow down. I didn't feel happy or smug about destroying her illusion. I just felt light, like I could finally breathe again. I turned to look at Julian, kind of worried he'd be totally freaked out by all the family drama. But he wasn't. He just looked up at me with this expression of total, absolute awe. He stood up from his chair and gently took my hand. He didn't say anything at all. He just kissed my knuckles, right over my little sapphire ring. It was exactly what I needed. I looked back at the rest of the table, and they were still completely frozen in shock. I just smiled, told them we were going to head out, and actually told them to enjoy their dinner. Walking out of that suffocating room and into the cool night air felt absolutely amazing. We didn't even talk about my mom on the drive home. We just talked about our wedding. A real wedding. We didn't even talk about my mother on the drive home. We just let the city lights wash over us. Instead, we talked about the botanical garden, the guest list, and our future. We were finally building a life together on our own terms. A future built on honesty, respect, and things that are actually real. No performances, no fake emeralds, just us. My mother didn't speak to me for 6 months after that dinner. Honestly, the silence was the greatest gift she could have given me. I just went back to my quiet, meticulous work. When she finally did reach out, it was just a stiff, formal text message about some holiday arrangement. She completely ignored what had happened. It was classic Eleanor, pretending the ugly stuff didn't exist. I didn't get mad, and I didn't take the bait. I just replied politely and kept my distance. The dynamic between us had permanently shifted, and we both knew it. She knew she could no longer control me. Her ultimate weapon of choice, that grand artificial superiority, had been permanently disabled. She was just a woman, sitting alone in a museum of things. I never saw her wear the Veronique Emerald again. I heard through the family grapevine she claimed it got stolen during a home break-in. It was a final, desperate lie to cover up the shame. But honestly, I didn't care what she told people. I had my peace, I had my truth, and I had Julian. That was all I ever really wanted anyway. Every time I look down at my hand, I see this delicate, intertwined band and the quiet sparkle of that Montana sapphire. It reminds me that true value isn't something you can buy. You can't just buy worth to impress a room full of strangers. True value is the peace you feel when you finally refuse to live inside someone else's lie. Julian kept spending his weekends down at the community garden, just getting his hands dirty. That's exactly what I loved about him from the start. He's so grounded and real, which was basically the exact opposite of the world I grew up in. I'd go down there and meet up with him, trading my appraisal tools for a pair of gardening gloves. Being surrounded by actual growing things and genuine people just felt right. It gave me this deep sense of belonging that no fancy country club ever could. Back at work, I found myself loving the appraisal process even more than before. I spent my days digging into the real history of forgotten family heirlooms. I learned to value honest, humble craftsmanship way more than any flashy, mass-produced illusion of wealth. Meanwhile, my mother was still just sitting in that meticulously curated museum she called a house. Without that fake emerald to prop up her ego, the whole place just felt empty. All those pristine white sofas and gold mirrors really just highlighted how completely alone she was. Julian and I just put all our energy into planning a future that actually meant something to us. We spent this one gorgeous afternoon walking through the local botanical garden. We were scouting out the perfect natural spot to finally have our wedding ceremony. As we were walking under these massive, ancient oak trees, Julian reached over and grabbed my hand. The little sapphire on my finger caught the sunlight coming through the leaves. It was just this quiet, perfect reminder of the honest promise we made to each other. When our wedding day finally arrived, it was exactly what we wanted. It was small, rustic, and just completely us. We stood under this simple wooden archway surrounded by bright flowers and the friends who actually cared about us, and we finally exchanged our vows. I wore this really simple, unpretentious dress that just felt like me. There was no heavy, performative glamour, no putting on a show for anyone else. Looking into Julian's eyes up there, I just felt this overwhelming certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. Aunt Beatrice actually came, sitting right in the front row with her real pearls. She watched the whole ceremony with this incredibly warm, genuine smile. I think she was just quietly proud of me for refusing to inherit the family's legacy of lies. When Julian finally kissed me, I rested my hand right against his chest. That little twig band and the modest sapphire just gleamed in the afternoon sun. It was the perfect symbol of a love built on actual truth instead of some exhausting illusion. But getting to that perfect day wasn't easy. We had to survive my mother first. It all started the Sunday after Julian proposed. We drove to her house to share the news. I braced myself for her reaction, knowing how she was. We sat down in her pristine living room. Julian was beaming with pride when he told her the news. A small part of me hoped she'd just be happy for us. Just this once. But she didn't look at my face. She didn't even look at Julian. Her eyes darted straight to my left hand. I watched her expression shift to this cold, flat calculation. She leaned forward and squinted at it, like she couldn't even see it. Then she put on this artificially sweet voice and just said, "Oh, how quaint." My heart just sank. I started babbling nervously to fill the silence. I told her Julian designed it himself. I tried to explain the sentimental value, hoping she'd understand. She just gave me this tight, patronizing smile. She called it a sweet little promise ring. She said Julian would upgrade it to a proper diamond eventually. Like he just couldn't afford better right now. Julian's hand tightened around mine. He's so patient, but I felt the insult land. He politely told her it wasn't a promise ring. He made it clear we were both thrilled with it. She didn't even argue. She just let out this soft, pitying sigh. She patted my knee like I was a child. And then she just changed the subject to her country club. I should have just let it go. But over the next few weeks, she escalated. She kept sending me links to massive diamond rings. She even suggested Aunt Beatrice could buy me a real one, so I wouldn't be embarrassed. When I told her to stop, she went behind my back. She secretly invited Julian to coffee. She lectured him about how a man's worth is judged. She actually offered him a loan to buy a 2-carat diamond. She told him he was making me look pitiful. When Julian finally told me about this meeting, he wasn't even angry. He was just incredibly sad for her, seeing right through her deep, festering insecurity. But I wasn't feeling sad at all. I was feeling a cold, white-hot fury. The breaking point arrived when my mother announced she was hosting an engagement dinner for us. She framed it as a generous gift, but I knew exactly what it was. It was a stage for her to play the grand matriarch and control the narrative. I tried to decline, but she immediately weaponized her guilt trips. She started crying about how she was a widow just trying to celebrate her only child. Exhausted and foolishly hoping to just keep the peace, Julian and I agreed to attend.
2 days before the dinner, I went over to my mother's house to help her sort out some floral arrangements.
She was upstairs taking a bath, leaving me alone to look for a specific vase. I was in her bedroom, reaching up to a top shelf in her walk-in closet. That's when my eye caught her heavy velvet jewelry box sitting wide open on her vanity. And sitting right on top was the Veronique Emerald. I don't know what compelled me to walk over to it. I'd seen that necklace 1,000 times from across dinner tables, but I'd never actually held it. My mother always claimed the oils from my skin would dull the stones. But standing there alone, the professional appraiser in me just took over. I reached out and picked it up. The very first thing I noticed was the weight, or rather, the complete lack of it. A collar made of solid platinum should have a significant, satisfying heft to it. But this felt surprisingly light, like brass. Frowning, I carried it over to the window to examine it in the natural light. As I turned it over, the temperature of the metal struck me. Real precious metals are excellent thermal conductors and feel distinctly cold when you first pick them up. This piece felt room temperature. It felt warm. My heart began to beat a little faster as a chaotic mixture of disbelief and professional curiosity washed over me. I always carried a small jeweler's loop in my purse out of habit. I pulled it out and walked back to the window. I pressed the small lens to my eye. I brought the necklace up to the light. The moment the metal came into focus, the grand illusion shattered. It wasn't just a fake. It was a remarkably cheap fake. I started with the hallmarks on the clasp. They hadn't been struck into the metal with a steel punch. They were cast directly into the mold. And right next to the supposed platinum mark, it was a tiny stamp that read CZ. Cubic zirconia. I moved the loop down to the halo of diamonds. They weren't diamonds. Under magnification, I could see soft, rounded facet edges. Genuine diamonds have razor-sharp junctions. Kidding. These even had tiny air bubbles trapped inside them. They were just poured glass. Then I looked at the center stone. The legendary Priceless emerald. The back of the setting was completely enclosed by metal. And when I looked closely at the edges, I saw green foil and the dried, yellowed residue of epoxy glue. I stood there in my mother's bedroom, staring at this piece of literal garbage in my hands. This was the necklace she lorded over everyone. It probably cost less than $100. She had spent 20 years lying to our family, her friends, and me. And she had the absolute nerve to call Julian's heartfelt, custom-made sapphire a cheap embarrassment. The sheer hypocrisy of it was staggering. She was willing to poison my happiness, all to protect a piece of foil-backed glass. I had never felt so furious in my life. I carefully placed the necklace back in the box, exactly as I had found it. I needed time to process the magnitude of the lie. I didn't want her to know I had seen it. Not yet, anyway. I took a deep breath and walked downstairs. I didn't say a word when my mother came downstairs.
I just helped her with the flowers.
She chatted away, completely oblivious, acting like the grand matriarch she pretended to be. I kissed her on the cheek and left. I didn't even tell Julian what I had found. I spent the next 2 days oscillating between pity and rage. Part of me felt sad for her. Sad for a woman so empty she needed green glass to feel worthy. But a much larger part of me was furious. I thought of all the times she made me feel small. By the time the evening of the dinner arrived, my sadness had completely evaporated. It left behind a cold, crystalline resolve. I was done shrinking. I was done protecting her fragile, venomous ego. It was time to face her. We arrived at the restaurant, and the private room was just dripping with excess. Heavy velvet curtains, massive crystal chandeliers, the works. It was the perfect stage for her grand performance. My mother was holding court at the head of the table. She was wearing this sleek black evening gown, and right there on her collarbone was the fake emerald. She looked positively radiant, just soaking up all the compliments. Aunt Beatrice was seated right next to her. She was wearing a quiet, genuinely expensive string of pearls. She just looked slightly bored by my mother's whole routine. Julian and I were seated near the middle of the table. True to form, she made sure she was the focal point, not us. But I didn't care. I just sat there, watching her. For the first 2 courses, she completely dominated the conversation. Bragging about her golf handicap, complaining about the country club, name-dropping people who barely knew her. It was exhausting. Eventually, one of her friends asked Julian how the wedding planning was going. Julian smiled and said, "We were thinking of keeping it small. Maybe an outdoor ceremony in a botanical garden." My mother let out this loud, theatrical sigh. She waved her wine glass and announced that an outdoor wedding is just a barbecue in a white dress. She said young people are too obsessed with being rustic. Then she paused, making sure she had everyone's full attention before she delivered the punchline. She looked right at my hand, gave this little condescending laugh, and said, "I suppose it matches the ring." The whole table went dead quiet. People were actually staring at my hand. I felt Julian stiffen beside me, ready to defend us. But I just reached under the table and put my hand over his, telling him to wait. Aunt Beatrice was the one who broke the silence. She frowned and asked what was wrong with my ring. She looked right at me and said she thought it was beautiful and very unique. My mother just offered this condescending little laugh. She told Aunt Beatrice it was a very sweet starter ring, but that Julian was just a teacher. She said we had to be realistic about what he could provide. She made sure she had everyone's full attention before taking a sip of her wine. Then her fingers fluttered right up to that massive green stone at her throat. She claimed she just wanted me to have something of real value. She was giving this tone of fake maternal concern as she lectured the table. She said jewelry was an investment that tells the world exactly who you are. She actually said a woman's jewelry should be a reflection of her worth. She looked directly at me and let out this soft, tinkling laugh. It was a laugh that basically said, my life, my choices, and the man I loved were fundamentally pathetic. And that was it. That was the exact moment the last string tying me to her toxic expectations finally snapped. I didn't yell, and I didn't cry. Instead, I felt this incredible, eerie sense of calm wash over me. I slowly picked up my water glass, took a sip, and set it back down on the table. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, letting the silence stretch out for just a second. I was completely done shrinking. My voice carried clearly down the length of the suddenly quiet table. I told her I had been thinking a lot about the Veronique Emerald lately, especially since I'd been doing so much appraisal work. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of an inch, but she recovered fast.
She shot back that she was sure her necklace was leagues above anything I handled.
She called them my little estate sales.
I kept my tone totally conversational. I told her it was certainly unique,
And that I was actually so fascinated by it that I took the liberty of looking at it through my jeweler's loupe on Tuesday. The color drained from my mother's face so fast she looked like she might pass out. Her hand, which had been resting so proudly on the necklace, suddenly dropped right into her lap. The whole room went dead silent. My mom snapped at me, her voice getting sharp and breathless. She told me I was never supposed to touch her jewelry, claiming it was priceless. You could see the panic setting in as she tried to take back control. I kept my tone super conversational, almost like I was giving an academic lecture. I told her priceless definitely wasn't the word I'd use. Then I brought up the hallmarks on the clasp, asking if she still claimed it was a 1920s Van Cleef original. She hissed a quick yes, her eyes darting nervously over to Aunt Beatrice. She was clinging so hard to that fake story about buying it at a private auction in Paris. But you could tell her confidence was completely crumbling. I just nodded slowly and laid out the facts. I explained how real Van Cleef hallmarks are hand-punched in platinum, but hers were cast right into the metal. And the kicker? There was a tiny secondary stamp right next to it that literally said CZ. A collective gasp rippled through all her wealthy friends at the table. My mom's mouth just fell open, but no sound came out. She was literally sitting there looking like a fish gasping for air. The illusion was completely shattered. I stood up slowly from my chair, making sure I didn't break eye contact with her for a single second. The whole room was dead silent. For the first time in my life, I wasn't shrinking down to make her feel bigger. I was taking up my own space. I kept going, my voice totally steady. I told everyone how the diamonds in the halo had molded facet junctions and trapped air bubbles inside them. Any appraiser knows that means they aren't diamonds at all. They're just cheap poured glass. Then I moved on to the main event, the big, legendary emerald itself. I pointed out that a real, high-quality emerald of that size would always have an open back to let the light shine through. But her setting was completely enclosed by the metal. She whispered at me to stop right then and there. Her voice was shaking so bad, a mix of total panic and rage. She actually tried to tell me I was embarrassing myself. But we both knew she was the only one drowning.
I told her I wasn't embarrassing myself.
I exposed how the stone was backed with green foil and glued in with cheap yellow epoxy. I told her to take off that $60 piece of garbage before she ever lectured my fiancé again. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of quiet that rings in your ears. Nobody dared to look at her. They just stared down at their plates. The grand matriarch had been completely destroyed. Aunt Beatrice was the first to react. She didn't gasp or look shocked. Instead, a slow, knowing smirk spread across her face. She adjusted her real pearls and took a slow sip of wine. She always knew my mom was a fraud. My mother's face went from pale to stark white to a furious red. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely control them. She tried to speak, but couldn't. She looked around and saw the truth in everyone's eyes. She couldn't take it anymore. She reached up and practically tore that necklace right off her throat. She shoved the fake emerald into her bag like it was on fire. It was a desperate move to cover up the shame. She stood up so fast, her chair scraped loudly against the floor. She didn't say a single word to anyone. She just grabbed her coat and stormed out of the room. A second later, the heavy oak door clicked shut. I stood there for a minute, letting the adrenaline run its course. I didn't feel triumphant or happy. I just felt this massive sense of relief. The suffocating weight of her lies was finally off my shoulders. I could breathe. I turned to look at Julian. He was looking up at me with pure awe and deep, unwavering respect. He stood up, gently took my hand, and kissed my knuckles, right over my sapphire ring. He was so proud. I looked around at the rest of the table. Keeping my voice calm, I announced that we were going to head out. I thanked everyone for coming and told them to enjoy their dinner. Then, Julian and I walked away. Walking out into the cool night air, I felt a lightness I had never known. We didn't even talk about my mother on the drive home. We talked about our future. A future built on honesty and things that are real. I never saw her wear that fake emerald again. The dynamic between us permanently shifted. Now, every time I look at my Montana sapphire, I know I made the right choice. True value is the peace of refusing to live a lie.